Something is happening in the waters of the Persian Gulf that the world's most powerful navies cannot officially stop. It is not a war. It is not an accident. It is not even technically illegal under the rules Iran has written for itself. It is a system. A carefully designed, deliberately constructed machine that extracts money, leverage, and power from one of the most critical waterways on the planet. And the frightening part is not that it exists. The frightening part is how long it has been operating in plain sight. Every single day, roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through a narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman. A strip so tight, so strategically positioned, that whoever controls it holds a hand around the throat of the global economy. Ships from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and the UAE have no choice but to sail through it. There is no alternate route. There is no detour. You either pass through the Strait of Hormuz, or your cargo never reaches the world. And Iran knows this better than anyone. But what most people don't realize is that Iran's strategy in the strait has evolved far beyond military threats and political posturing. What has quietly emerged over the past decade is something more sophisticated, more dangerous, and far harder to confront. A hybrid system of coercion, legal manipulation, and selective enforcement that functions, in every practical sense, like a piracy operation with government paperwork. This is the story of how that system was built, who benefits from it, and why the world has struggled to respond. To understand what is happening now, you have to go back to the beginning. Iran did not always view the Strait of Hormuz as a weapon. For decades, it was simply geography, a fact of the map. Iranian officials understood its value, but the country's relationship with international shipping was relatively conventional. Tankers moved, oil flowed, the world kept turning. Then came the pressure, sanctions, international isolation, frozen assets, restrictions on Iranian oil exports that cut deeply into the country's revenue. Each new round of economic pressure forced Tehran to recalculate its position. And somewhere in those calculations, a realization crystallized. They did not need to sell oil to profit from oil. They just needed to control the water it traveled through. The first signs appeared subtly. Iranian patrol boats began increasing their presence around commercial shipping lanes. Communications became more frequent, more intrusive. Foreign vessels reported being hailed by Iranian naval personnel, asked for information that had no clear legal basis. At first it seemed like routine surveillance, an assertion of regional presence, nothing more. But this is where things take a serious turn. Because what began as surveillance gradually transformed into something with much higher stakes. Vessels started being boarded, not always violently, not always dramatically. Sometimes it was nothing more than Iranian officials stepping aboard a ship, reviewing documents, and departing. But the message being delivered was unmistakable. We can reach you, we can stop you. We decide whether you continue. Between 2019 and 2024, more than 20 commercial vessels were seized, detained, or interfered with by Iranian forces in or near the Strait of Hormuz. Some were held for weeks, some for months. Crews were detained, questioned, and in certain cases used as bargaining chips in larger diplomatic negotiations. The ships themselves, often carrying hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cargo, sat idle while their owners scrambled to understand what they had done wrong and who they needed to pay to make it right. Officially, Iran always had an explanation. Environmental violations, document irregularities, suspicion of sanctions, busting, proximity to restricted coordinates. The justifications changed, the pattern did not. What most people don't realize is that many of these detentions had nothing to do with the stated reasons. They were timed, sequenced, triggered not by genuine legal violations, but by geopolitical moments. When Iran was facing increased pressure from Washington, a ship would be seized. When negotiations stalled, another crew would find themselves guests of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. When Tehran wanted attention, the strait would suddenly develop a new emergency. The seizures were not random acts of aggression. They were negotiating tools dressed in the language of law enforcement. And this is the genius, if that word can be used, of the system Iran constructed. By creating a bureaucratic and legal framework around its enforcement actions, Iran gave itself a layer of protection that pure military aggression would never have provided. A navy firing on a commercial vessel is an act of war. A coast guard boarding a ship for a document inspection is, at least in the language of international maritime law, something far more ambiguous. The structure behind these operations runs deeper than most outside observers have reported. At the center of it sits the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, a force that operates separately from Iran's conventional military and answers directly to the supreme leader. Unlike regular naval forces bound by standard military protocols, the IRGC Navy operates with a level of operational autonomy that gives it enormous flexibility. It can act, pause, escalate, or retreat based on political calculations happening in Tehran, often with no public explanation and no accountability to external bodies. But what happened next changed everything. Because around 2020, a secondary layer began to emerge. Alongside the military component, Iranian authorities began developing what can only be described as a toll collection infrastructure. Not a formal tariff system published in maritime law, something more informal, more deniable, more effective. Shipping companies operating in the region began receiving signals, sometimes direct and sometimes passed through intermediaries, that certain arrangements could facilitate smoother passage through Iranian-controlled waters. Legal fees, consultation payments, arrangements with specific Iranian-linked entities for insurance, bunkering, or port services that were not strictly necessary but became practically unavoidable. The line between a fee and a bribe, between a service and a shakedown, between a legal requirement and coercion. That line was deliberately blurred. And in that blur, enormous sums of money began to flow. Shipping executives who operate in the region speak carefully when discussing this. Publicly, almost none will comment on record. The liability exposure is too significant. The relationship's too delicate. The risk of becoming a target too real. But privately, in conversations with maritime lawyers, insurance specialists, and logistics consultants who work the Gulf routes, a picture emerges that is consistent and deeply troubling. Companies that resist these informal arrangements find themselves facing elevated scrutiny, inspections that take longer than normal, documentation requests that multiply, sudden discoveries of technical violations that require extended stays in Iranian-adjacent waters, and companies that cooperate, that find ways to route payments through the right channels, that hire the right consultants, that use the right services, find that their ships move through the strait with remarkable efficiency. This is where things get complicated in a way that mainstream reporting rarely captures. Because the corruption here is not one-sided, the system works precisely because it creates incentives on both sides of the transaction. Iranian-linked entities profit. Shipping companies avoid costly delays. Insurance premiums get factored into operational budgets. The money moves. The oil moves. And everyone involved has a reason to keep the arrangement quiet. The victims of this system are not primarily the shipping companies, who can often absorb the costs or pass them on. The victims are the countries whose energy security depends on reliable passage through the strait. The consumers at the end of supply chains who pay higher prices without understanding why. And the principle of international maritime law itself, which is slowly being hollowed out by a precedent that says waterways can be monetized by whoever is willing to project enough force. The international response to this system has been, to put it charitably, inadequate. Part of the problem is legal. The Strait of Hormuz exists in a genuinely complex jurisdictional environment. Under international law, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, ships have the right of transit passage through international straits. Iran, notably, is not a signatory to that convention. Tehran maintains its own interpretation of what rights foreign vessels have in waters it considers within its sphere of influence. This creates a legal no-man's land that Iran has exploited with remarkable skill. When challenged on specific detentions or boardings, Iranian officials can point to domestic legislation, to bilateral agreements, to environmental regulations, to security protocols, and argue that their actions fall within recognized frameworks. The international community can object. It can protest. It can pass resolutions. But the mechanisms for actually compelling Iran to change its behavior are blunt, slow, and often counterproductive. Military escorts help. Since 2019, several naval coalitions have formed to protect commercial shipping in the region. The United States, the United Kingdom, and other allies have maintained enhanced naval presence in the Gulf. But coverage is not constant. Ships travel in large numbers, and Iranian operations are often calibrated precisely to find the gaps, to target vessels that are momentarily beyond the protection of coalition assets. What most people don't realize is that Iran has become extraordinarily sophisticated at reading the operational patterns of Western naval forces. It knows when carrier groups rotate. It tracks surveillance assets. It times its operations accordingly. The seizure of a tanker rarely happens when a U.S. destroyer is 5 miles away. It happens in the window between. The money flowing through this system is difficult to quantify precisely, but estimates from people working in Gulf shipping suggest the figures are significant. Direct seizure-related costs, including legal fees, crew payments, cargo losses, and delay penalties, have run into the hundreds of millions of dollars across documented incidents over the past 5 years. But that is only the visible surface. The more substantial flows are the informal ones, the consultation arrangements, the service contracts. The insurance premiums inflated specifically because of the Iranian risk factor. One maritime insurance specialist described it as a geography tax, an additional cost of doing business in that specific corridor that flows through various channels and intermediaries toward entities connected to the IRGC and its affiliated commercial networks. Those networks are extensive. The IRGC is not simply a military organization. Over decades of sanctions and isolation, it has built a parallel economic empire inside Iran that spans construction, telecommunications, energy, banking, and logistics. The same organization that runs patrol boats in the Strait of Hormuz also runs companies that benefit from the disruption those patrol boats create. The conflict of interest is not incidental, it is structural, and that structure ensures that the incentive to maintain pressure on international shipping never disappears, because the pressure itself generates revenue. But here is what makes this story genuinely dangerous beyond the immediate financial implications. The Strait of Hormuz precedent is being watched. Other actors in other regions, with their own strategic choke points, are observing how effectively Iran has leveraged geography into economic and political power. The lesson being absorbed is not subtle. Control a critical waterway. Build a legal and bureaucratic framework around your enforcement actions. Make the costs of resistance high enough that accommodation becomes the rational choice. And then collect. The South China Sea has its own choke points. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden has seen Houthi attacks, an Iranian-backed group, demonstrating precisely this logic in a different geography. The Bosphorus, the Malacca Strait, the Kerch Strait, everywhere there is a narrow passage and a state willing to apply pressure. The Hormuz model offers a template. This is where things take a serious turn on a global scale. Because if the international community cannot develop an effective response to what Iran has built in the Strait of Hormuz, it is not just failing to protect shipping in one region. It is signaling to every ambitious regional power that strategic geography can be weaponized with limited consequences. That international maritime law is a set of suggestions rather than rules. That the global trading system, which depends on the free movement of ships through international waters, is more vulnerable than the world has been willing to acknowledge. The ships still sail. Every day, tankers loaded with crude oil from Saudi Arabia and the UAE navigate the narrow corridor between the Iranian coast and the Omani island of Musandam. The oil reaches refineries. Gasoline fills tanks. Power plants stay online. From the outside, the system appears to be functioning. But beneath that surface, something has changed that cannot easily be unchanged. A toll has been established. Not officially, not transparently, not through any process that the international community recognized or approved, but effectively, practically. In the way that actually matters, which is that people are paying it, and the entity collecting it has every incentive to keep collecting. The question that remains unanswered, and that decision makers in Washington, Brussels, Riyadh, and Tokyo are quietly struggling with, is whether this system can be dismantled without triggering the very confrontation that everyone wants to avoid. Because Iran understands something that its adversaries have been slow to internalize. The threat is the product. The uncertainty, the risk, the possibility that any given ship on any given day might become the next incident, that is the mechanism that keeps the informal payments flowing and the leverage intact. Resolve the threat and you eliminate the business model. But resolving the threat requires a level of confrontation that carries its own enormous costs. And so the ships keep sailing, the money keeps moving, the patrol boats keep circling. Somewhere in the waters between Iran and Oman, a tanker is making its way through the narrowest point of the strait. Its crew is watching the radar. Its captain is thinking about the route ahead. Its owner is thinking about insurance premiums and delay clauses and the quiet cost of doing business in a place where geography has become a weapon. The world needs that oil. The world needs that passage. And someone in Tehran knows exactly how much the world is willing to pay to keep it open. The toll trap is set. It has been set for years. And the most unsettling thing about it is not that it exists. It is that no one has figured out how to close it.